हाँ हाँ हाँ. So you go. We have people. We have people. I have asked. Okay. Pawan is there. His name is Pawan. You sit here. There's everything I don't. I have to ask. You want to go? Ask them to come and sit at the front. This person in wheelchair. Go and sit over there. ma'am? A very good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for gathering here on time. We'll be starting the session soon. May I please request our dignitaries to please come onto the stage. Please give them a huge round of applause. We welcome all of you to the International Conference on Invisible Infrastructures, Gender, Caste and Politics of Presence in India's Digital Spaces. Thank you. Hi everyone. I am Dr. Ritu Varghese. I am an assistant professor at School of Social Sciences and Humanities here at VIT-AP University, and I welcome you all to our International Conference on Invisible Infrastructures 2025. We call it ICII 2025. So today we have with us a very eminent list of dignitaries. So the Dean in charge, Dr. Priyanka Ghosh, is not here. So Dr. Rakhi and K will be representing Dr. Priyanka Ghosh. So may I request Dr. Rakhi ma'am to please come and give the welcome address. Ma'am.
A very good morning to everyone present here. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the inaugural ceremony of International Conference on Invisible Infrastructures, Gender, Caste and Politics of Presence in India's Digital Space, ICII 2025. I would like to extend my heartfelt greetings to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Dr. S.V. Kota Reddy, our Registrar, Dr. Jagdish Chandra Mudigandi, who could not be here due to their busy schedules. I would also welcome Dean, VIT School of Business, Dr. Arun Kumar Shivakumar, who graciously agreed to be with us here today. I welcome all the deans, heads of departments, distinguished faculty, research scholars, dear students. Your presence here lends immense value to the inauguration of this conference and sets the stage for a truly engaging and thought-provoking academic gathering. On behalf of VIT-AP University and School of Social Sciences and Humanities, I extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished chief guest, Dr. Avishek Parui, Associate Professor English in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. Professor Parui's research spans memory studies, critical theory, and the intersection of literature, cognition, and digital cultures. He leads the Center for Memory Studies at IIT Madras and is a founding chair of the Indian Network of Memory Studies. It is an honor to have you with us today to inaugurate this conference and share your insights with us. This year's conference is held at a very significant time. As a nation, we are undergoing a profound digital transformation. So the question of who becomes visible and who remains unseen have become central to the underlying power of our online words, or understanding the power in our online words. The conference brings together an interdisciplinary community of scholars, practitioners, activists, and students to examine how digital infrastructures, platforms, languages, and even algorithms mediate visibility, agency, and exclusion. These are not merely technological systems, but deeply social and cultural architectures that reproduce privilege and marginality in new forms. This conference is held in collaboration with the Indian Institute of Human Settlements, IIHS. This, we believe, deepens the inquiry by reminding us that infrastructures, whether physical or digital, are lived spaces embedded in everyday hierarchies of gender, caste, and access. As one of the India's leading institutions studying urban transformation, IIHS brings to this partnership a grounded and critical understanding of how power operates through design, governance, and everyday practice. Now, allow me to briefly introduce our school. The VIT-AP School of Social Sciences and Humanities, VISH as we call it, brings together disciplines that examine how societies think, communicate, and evolve. Our programs are designed to cultivate critical, creative, and socially conscious thinkers who can engage with complexities of our world. From the BA, MA dual degree to our recent initiatives in interdisciplinary research, our school encourages our students to think across boundaries, connecting humanities with policy, media, and technology, among a few. Over the years, VISH has hosted several conferences. We have our annual conference, Athena, and we hosted ICII's 2024. They all addressed issues on sustainability, inequality, and digital futures of Global South. Each conference has sought to bridge theory and practice, academia and lived experiences. And ICII 2025 carries this commitment forward. I would like to take this moment to thank our Honorable Vice Chancellor, our Registrar, and the entire administration of VIT-AP University for their continued support. My sincere appreciation goes to the entire conference organizing team for their vision and dedicated effort in shaping this conference, especially the conveners, Dr. Anjida and Dr. Ashraf. To all the presenters and participants, thank you for bringing your ideas, your research, and your energy to the platform. I hope these discussions will not only illuminate invisible infrastructures, but also inspire us to imagine more equitable digital futures. Finally, I thank my colleagues, research scholars, our undergraduate students, all the other students from various departments, our paper presenters for their tremendous support to this conference. We extend a very warm welcome to all of you and hope to wish to host you in the best of our abilities. Once again, I welcome you all to ICII 2025. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Each event is a testimony of a vision imagined and executed to make the world a better place. And may I now request Dr. Anjita Gopi, convener of ICII, to share with us a few words from her vision. May we give her a huge round of applause.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rakhi. Good morning, everybody. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome all of you to our conference, ICII, International Conference on Invisible Infrastructure, Gender, Caste, and Politics of Presence in India's Digital Space, organized by the School of Social Sciences and Humanities in collaboration with the Indian Institute for Human Settlement. So when we began planning this conference, we knew that we were stepping into a niche but very urgent intellectual landscape. Our intention was to build a space to hold complexity where research does not just report some findings, but to develop or start a conversation, an open conversation on visibility, exclusion, and the power in an increasingly digital India. In a world where technology promises neutrality and access, the politics of presence remains deeply unequal. Algorithms determine what we encounter, linguistic privilege shapes who is heard, and platforms mediate whose voices gain credibility. To speak of infrastructure today is to look beyond the wires, codes, and systems. It is to encounter the emotional, cultural, and social architectures that decide whose participation is facilitated and whose silence is normalized. These invisible infrastructures definitely shape our identity, belonging, justice, in profoundly material ways. So our collaboration with IIHS brings a grounded dimension into this inquiry. As Dr. Rakhi said, that we are experiencing one of the world's largest digital and urban migration. IIH's expertise in urban policy, design, and inclusive development anchors our discussion in lived realities. One of the strengths of ICII this time is its commitment to interdisciplinary conversation. Here, scholars and practitioners meet across the intersections of humanities, technology, policy, and everyday experiences. So these exchanges between data and narrative, between theory and practice, are conversations that we hope will continue even after the conference. Here, I would like to highlight two important components of this year's conference. First, we had a pre-conference workshop by Richa Das, who is publisher from Springer Nature, and she offered great insights into publishing ecosystems and evolving ethics of research visibility. Second, we are very proud to host a graduate colloquium which opens a supportive space for undergraduate and postgraduate students to share early ideas and receive constructive mentorship. This initiative also reflects our school's belief that curiosity, when nurtured with guidance, becomes the foundation for scholarship. We remain incredibly grateful grateful to our publication partners for ensuring that dialogues initiated here continues to travel, are documented and published and read widely. Now, a special note of appreciation goes to our Dean in charge, Dr. Priyanka, for her steady encouragement and quiet determination in helping us navigate every stage of this journey. My sincere thanks to Honorable Vice Chancellor, Registrar Sir, University Administration for their strength, support and generosity. We're also deeply honored to have our chief guest, Dr. Avishek Parui from IIT Madras with us. He graciously accepted our invitation and traveled to be here in person, and his encouragement throughout this journey has meant a great deal for us. We would also like to acknowledge Professor Lee Koi Cheng from National University of Singapore, who was originally scheduled to be with us here. She's very keen to join she was very keen to join in person. However, due to unavoidable logistical reasons, she is now participating online. So we remain very grateful for her commitment to the conference. Here, as a convener, I must recognize something that's foundational to the making of this conference, the extraordinary work of our research scholars, from coordinating logistics to managing reviews, communication, and everyday activities of ICII. It's built on their dedication and resilience. And I also like to mention my colleague, Dr. Ashraf Pulikamith, who has worked with unwavering steadiness in the inception, from the inception of the idea. Finally, to every collaborator, colleague, paper presenter, and participant, thank you for your rigor, imagination, and generosity that you bring. Your ideas give this conference its pulse. May the next 2 days remind us that visibility is not just about being seen, but is also about being understood, and that our shared responsibility as scholars and citizens is to imagine and build infrastructure that are more humane, inclusive, and just. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Anjita. Associate Fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. He has contributed immensely to the scholarship surrounding memory studies in postmodern literature. He's the author of Postmodern Literatures, Culture and the Literary, Matter, Metaphor and Memory, and co-editor of Memory Studies in India, Texts and Contexts. He's a faculty coordinator of Center for Memory Studies, CMS, at IIT Madras, and also the co-founding chairperson of the Indian Network for Memory Studies, INMS. He also serves as a member of the Advisory Board of Memory Studies Association, Editorial Board of Memory Mind and Media Journal of Cambridge University Press, and jury member for the Sahitya Academy. He has supervised 7 PhD scholars, and several are working under him on various aspects of memory studies as well. He is a published writer of short fiction and director of Skillscapes, a knowledge.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Verghese, for a very kind and very generous introduction. It's an absolute pleasure and honor for me to be here in what is, I believe, honestly believe, a fabulously conceptualized conference. And I must congratulate Dr. Anjita Gopi and other colleagues who put together such stellar efforts to make this happen. And of course, it's a beautiful campus, and we talk about infrastructure, and this has got to be one of the best infrastructures I've seen in recent times in an educational institution. So I think this conference augurs very well, very positively for a really fabulous knowledge exchange in the times to come, in the next couple of days, and also subsequently, hopefully, into more tangible frameworks such as published proceedings and other kinds of conversations that the organizers must have hoped and planned for already. So I have a keynote coming up, so don't want to give away too many spoilers in terms of what I'm going to talk, but just a very generic and philosophical note on this particular conference. If you look at the title, it's about invisible infrastructures and the politics of presence. And of course, there are different verticals like different forms of identity such as gender, caste, which are operational under this particular framework. Now, the real beauty of the conference in terms of its philosophical density lies in this interplay of invisibility and presence. Now, as you know, and I think the organizers touched upon this already, Dr. Verghese and Dr. Gopi both mentioned this quite interestingly, in terms of looking at how presence is always political, as you know. Presence is always designed discursively. And there are different forms of infrastructures which are operational towards the production of presence. Now, obviously, we're locating this conference diachronically in terms of its contemporaneity, in terms of looking at it in the post-digital world. But it is important for us to also historicize this politics of presence. And of course, we're looking at it from the moment now, which is the post-algorithmic infrastructure. But we have to remind ourselves, students of history, that presence was always political. The whole idea of infrastructure was always operated through dynamics of power, whether we go back to the ancient pyramids of Egypt, whether we go back to the whole idea of monumental memory in terms of who had the capital to build a monument, to commemorate different forms of knowledge, and of course, what each monument not just erected in terms of the magnificent building and the monumentality, but also what each monument buried, what each monument invisibilized. To organize a conference like this, because obviously I'm aware of the magnificent work of both Dr. Verghese and Dr. Gopi. I mean, their work is really foundational, I think, in terms of looking at the politics of food, in terms of the appearance and disappearance of food in a post-digital world. And also, if I may say, I mean, what I find personally most attractive in that work is the very strategic stylization of certain kinds of food, right? Now, as you know, if I may steal a little bit from that magnificent research, even food becomes a very interesting architecture which requires infrastructure in terms of, if we talk about, let's say, something like the gastro capital or food industry, you'll realize that even something as innocuous sounding as that also operates through politics of presence, also operates through politics of reconstruction and disappearance. Now, each of these terms, disappearance, encoding, reconstruction, these are mutable kinetic categories, as you know. So the forgotten food today can make a big comeback tomorrow as retro food, as retro cuisine, right? And what is popular today can also be made to disappear depending on the ideological impulses and discursive designs of that particular time. So for example, if I were to just give you a very personal example, I come from a city of Kolkata. I've been outside the city for a number of years now, but every time I go back to the city, it is amazing how the really expensive food in the big restaurants in Kolkata are the retro food, right? The forgotten food that our grandmothers made many years ago, which didn't cost anything back then, but it cost a bomb to actually eat those food because they have this retro capital arranged around it. Now that is a very good example of how disappearance and reappearance can be connected to different forms of infrastructural investments. And I think I really laud the work that Dr. Gopi and Dr. Varghese do together, I honestly think is fabulous research. And I think this particular conference would crystallize this research and many other research networks in not just this couple of days, but also, I hope, in a very long-term, structural, permanent way. So I, for one, I'm very excited to be here, not just to be a speaker, but also as a learner, because we're all co-learners in an ecosystem of knowledge. And I come here and stand with you with a lot of gratitude and humility, and as someone very, very eager and looking forward to learn from this fabulous organized conference in the next couple of days and also beyond. So thank you very much to the organizers, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your very insightful and encouraging words. It's time to felicitate our chief guest now. May I now request Dr. Arun Kumar Shivakumar, sir. He is Dean, VIT-AP School of Business, and Dr. Rakhi to felicitate our guest with a token of our love and gratitude. May we have a huge round of applause. May I also request everyone to keep the applause going. Thank you. So the memento is a token of our love and gratitude to Dr. Parui for taking the time and effort from his very, very busy schedule to be with us at ICII. Thank you so much, sir. May I now request Dr. Ashraf Pulikamat, he is also the convener of ICII, to give the vote of thanks. Sir.
A very good morning to one and all, dignitaries on the dais, and my beloved audience in front of me. I think you have been hearing names already many times, and it can be quite boring, but it's a part of protocol that I have to recite them again. And it's never completed without thanking at the end of the session. So first, let me extend my deepest gratitude to the management of VIT, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Registrar Sir, and the entire VIT management team for their unwavering encouragement, for enabling such a wonderful conference as all the times in our school, in our campus, and that too hybrid, offline and online. Their constant support strengthens the academic vision that we share together. My and our team's heartfelt thanks go to the Dean in charge of VISH, Dr. Priyanka Ghosh, again in absentia. She is attending another conference in Jaipur, whose guidance have actually guided us sharper than we expected. And the end of that journey is here on this stage today. In her absence today, we are grateful to Dr. Rakhi for graciously representing the school at the place of Dean and joining us in the inaugural and continuing to support us hereafter too. Thank you, ma'am, for your presence and support. I would also like to acknowledge our research coordinator, VISH, Dr. Rashida, for her steady support always. We are honored too by the presence of our chief guest, Dr. Avishek from IIT Madras, who graciously accepted our invitation and joined us on campus today. Sir, your encouragement and your engagement with the audience and your graceful comments on our campus and organization is truly touching, and I am thanking you on behalf of the entire organizing committee for the same. Our sincere thanks to our knowledge partner, IIHS, Bangalore. This collaboration has brought depth, perspective, and intellectual rigor to ICII 2025. We are grateful to Dr. Aditi from IIHS for her talk and her contribution to the dialogue. We have already started certain sessions like pre-conference workshop in the morning online, and I thank all the speakers and presenters who already completed their dialogues in the conference. I also extend my sincere thanks to the other invited speakers, Professor Lee from National University Singapore, Professor Madheshwaran from former Director of Institute for Social and Economic Change, Bangalore, Dr. Aditi from IIHS, which I already mentioned, and Dr. Richa Das from Springer Nature, who have graciously joined us as speakers for the conference. I deeply appreciate your willingness to engage with us, with all our participants. Our gratitude extends to our publication partners, as you see on the screen, who have supported the academic vision of the conference and strengthened its long-term capacity. A special note of appreciation goes to our research scholars and BA students. I repeat, a special mention to our research scholars and BA students, whose relentless effort forms the foundation of this conference. Their work, their logistics, communication, reviews, and coordination been instrumental in bringing the conference to our life. We also extend our gratitude to the school colleagues, my fellow beloved colleagues, faculty in VISH and other schools, who stepped in to assist and encourage us wherever it was required. Your solidarity has meant a great deal to us. Our sincere thanks to organizing committee, my own group, whose commitment, as not to mention, was uncommentable in my language. We remain indebted to a set of committees and organizations in the campus, such as SDC, CTS, Social Media Committee, clubs, especially those are classical music, Nrityam, Be the Heat, Malayalam associations, who will be presenting a cultural bonanza in the evening today. The purchase office, maintenance office, finance office, transport office, and the guest house office, and the maintenance staff, who are, let's say, putting the additional soul to the event in terms of execution in campus. Finally, to all our speakers, paper presenters, and participants, thank you for bringing your insight, curiosity, and intellectual to the energy of ICII 2025. The dialogues that you initiated here are what we give us the conference, its depth and meaning. Finally, thank you for giving me this opportunity too. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ashraf. So we are bringing our inaugural session to a conclusion now. There is no break in between as such. The session right now, it will be followed by the plenary talk by Dr. Parui. So we'll be starting it right now. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Stand here as a student in this conference and this great opportunity to speak. And the title of my talk is Memory, Affect, and Invisible Infrastructures. It's a very generic title, as you can imagine, but what I'm hoping to achieve through this talk is to perhaps engage with some of the philosophical bits that this conference is trying to engage with. And I honestly think it's a wonderful dialogue that this conference is trying to set up in terms of looking at the relationship or the entanglement between presence and absence, between visibilization and invisibilization, and infrastructure. And at the very outset, what I would invite you to do is to look at the word infrastructure not as a static noun, but as a process of becoming, unbecoming, and rebecoming. In other words, let's try to transform the word infrastructure as something akin to what Judith Butler does with gender, from being a static noun to a verb, because infrastructure is always just a process of becoming, unbecoming, and rebecoming. And of course, it's an overt process as well as a covert process, and which is why I think this conference is so refreshingly radical, because it actually looks at the invisible infrastructures, the points which don't appear, the points where the real work gets done, the real power dynamics operate, the real condensation and crystallization of discursive designs take place, which must stay invisible, which must stay outside of the discourse network, right? Because the whole idea of the power presence would be to somehow invisibilize itself and become some kind of a center. And as you know, as Jacques Derrida told us way back in the 60s, the center is not at the center, right? The center is elsewhere. The whole ontology of the center lies in its invisibility, right? So if you find out where the center is, the whole structure will collapse, because then you realize this is a construct and not a given. So for any power dynamic, for any power network to really become a grand narrative, it must aspire towards the sublime. It must aspire towards the transcendental. It must aspire to the metaphysical. In other words, for any power dynamic to be fully operational, to be fully successful in terms of its hierarchy, functionality, etc., it must somehow transform itself from a physical, corporeal, something which goes beyond the radar of rhetoric, the radar of deconstruction, the radar of interrogation. So that is my premise. Now, as was very kindly mentioned in the introduction, it was a very gracious introduction. I must thank the organizers for such a flattering bio note. Now, I'm a student of memory studies, and we have the Center for Memory Studies at IIT Madras. Some of you may be aware of it. All of you are very welcome to visit us at any time. So we try to do some work in terms of bringing together different dimensions of memory. Now, when I use the word dimensions of memory, the obvious suspects are the psychological, neurobiological, the neuroscientific, the molecular dimensions, in other words, in terms of how memory works in the brain, in terms of how brains remember and forget, minds remember and forget, etc. That's the obvious vertical. What we try to do in our center, in our modest ways, is connect this particular vertical to the monumental understanding of memory, in terms of how cultures remember and forget, in terms of how nations remember and forget, in terms of how history gets written and unwritten, etc. In other words, we try to connect the molecular and the monumental in discursive, diachronic ways. So what that means is, this entails a study of memory as an inner material, in terms of how neurons and synapses fire away, produce electrochemical reactions or the lack of it, and encode information, etc. The very hardcore scientific understanding of the brain. And we do collaborate with some excellent neuroscientists, and some of you may have come to a recent conference. You may have heard Alex Easton, who is a psychologist from Durham, but also trying to take this particular apparatus, this particular knowledge apparatus, and connect it to the cultural frameworks of memory, right? In terms of how history gets written, in terms of how monuments are mandated, in terms of how structures are built to commemorate, to remember. Now, what this means is this connect between the micro and the macro dimensions of memory, or the molecular and the monumental dimensions of memory. There are several things which do the connect. There are several things which do the buffering job. But one can do worse than look at narratives, right? Because narratives become a very important buffer point in terms of connecting how memory works as a molecular activity and a monumental activity. Because at some level, memory is a story that a brain tells to the self. In some level, memory is a believable story that every brain produces in terms of what it wants to remember. Now notice I'm using the word story, which scientists don't quite like, but have very grudgingly come to acknowledge as a reality of memory, because memory is a story. Memory is some kind of a neural narrative, if you like, how neurons create a narrative which help us to remember. Now, it is easier for us to understand memory as a story when we talk about the macro model of memory, because the word history, as you can see, contains within it the story. his story. And of course, it's very male-centered and very phallocentric in many ways, which is why I really laud the organizers of this conference to flag up the gendered aspect of visibility and invisibility in terms of the gendered aspect of architecture, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. I'll come to that a little bit later. But it is important for us to start with this premise that narratives are a very important part of the entire memory studies ecology, whether we're looking at memory as a brain mechanism or whether you're looking at memory as a monumental mechanism through the construction of pyramids and mausoleums and history books and all the rest of it. Now, this allows us to come to the other bit of my keynote, the affect bit. Now, affect, as you can understand, is something which is emotional. It constitutes emotion, it constitutes sentiment, but it's a little bit different from just emotions. Again, if I could go back to Judith Butler, if you remember the very famous Butler differentiation between performance and performativity, where she talks about how performativity is that performance which produces an effect. That performance which produces a theater of effect, which is to be consumed, which is to be performed not just as a static act, but also as something which addresses an audience, which is to be consumed, which is to be produced in very kinetic, theatrical, and very effective ways. And therein lies the politics of affect. Affect must be able to move the subject. Now, movement is, again, a very complex word. Movement happens both viscerally in terms of how you are moved when you see something spectacular, when you're moved when you see a work of art or a great performance. But move can also be a diachronic intersubjective phenomenon, right? An audience can be moved by something. You go to watch a great film, you're moved by it as an audience. You see a spectacular Lionel Messi goal and you celebrate as an audience, and that has that effect. Now, what that means is, affect can do very complex things. Affect can both arouse emotions, but equally, affect can also galvanize emotions. It can create an emotion which can galvanize different subjects together. So in other words, affect can also produce imagined communities. Now, again, let me use a very banal, vulgar example of sports. Right, a very quick example. It is perfectly possible for someone sitting in Kolkata or Kochi and someone sitting in Buenos Aires, some part of Argentina, to have an affective kinship at the end of a Lionel Messi goal, right? It is perfectly possible for a Kochi audience and a Buenos Aires audience to weep in joy at the end of one event. Now, these are people who never meet each other. These are people who have absolutely no connect, no commonality, apart from that moment of that Messi performance. I think I'm revealing too much that I'm a Messi fan. But I'm using him as a metaphor, if you forgive me. But the point is, that particular act is an affective act. It can generate affect, it can also galvanize affect. It can arouse emotions, it can galvanize emotions, it can connect strangers. Now, before we become too euphoric, it is also important to acknowledge as sports fans that this can also create the other effect, hostility. It can also create xenophobia. It can also create violence. It can also create othering. Now, it is easy to talk about othering in a hardcore political way. Well, if you are a believer in party A, you hate people in party B. I mean, that's easy. It's also interesting to understand how othering can also happen in supposedly innocuous forms. How supporters of one particular football club can other supporters of the other football club. And this can go to actual hostility. This can actually move to actual violence. Well, I'm sure you've heard stories about fans attacking each other, getting into proper actual violence because they support some stranger scoring a goal 10,000 kilometers away. That is a power of effect. That is a power of invisible effect. Now, what that means is, when we talk about infrastructure, which is a third element in my talk, Now, infrastructure as a definition, it has a functional quality. This microphone is working, we're all sitting, the AC is on. So there's proper, effective, functional quality about infrastructure, failing which it will not work. Ontologically speaking, it requires functionality as an on-tick function. We understand that, it's easy. But infrastructure can also be not just effective, but also affective in quality. Infrastructure can also arouse emotions and galvanize emotions. Now, a very quick way to understand this, again, I'm using material examples from everyday life because I think we need to, and I think the organizers will agree with this when I say that this is a conference which needs to be pushed outside just a classroom, right? And in terms of understanding how infrastructures work in what we think are non-discursive spaces. The difference between watching a blockbuster in a mediocre cinema hall and watching a blockbuster in a PVR, that is an example of affective infrastructure. That is an example of how you consume affect because there's Dolby sound around you. There is better affective infrastructure around you. Now you notice when you go to that kind of a sophisticated infrastructure, it actually relies on invisibility to a large extent. And this is where it becomes a very interesting study of capital, the capitalism which is invested in the infrastructure. Now you'll notice that for very high capital networks, very powerful capital networks, companies with enormous capital, companies with an endless resource of money or capital of any form, in a way, they need to move away from the effective to the affective to a large extent, right? Now, a very quick example of this, and again, I'm giving you a very normal, everyday quotidian example, if you may. If you go to any big shopping mall, and I'm pretty sure there are many in Amravati, I mean, Hyderabad is a magnificent city for that. Chennai, too, has some good examples. If you enter any big shopping mall, it's a very quick way to understand which particular shopping space, which particular, let's say, shop, which particular area has more capital compared to which particular area has less capital, would be to see how effective that particular shop is. I'm sure you've seen shops in shopping mall where an enormous area, let's say this entire dais, a little bit more than this, is one room with just one table in the middle of it and one mobile phone. That's it. That's probably an Apple shop. It doesn't need to pack in with materials. It doesn't need to prove its effective functional thing anymore because it has already acquired that enormous sublime capital where it can operate purely as an affective category, right? So affect is very political. Affect is very problematic. Affect requires an enormous invisible capital which would make it work and which would make it appear sublime, transcendental, metaphysical, etc. Now this is Culture Studies 101 in a certain sense, right? For any undergrad early course in Culture Studies, this is like a tautology truism. If anyone is in a business of becoming a grand narrative, the absolute golden mean towards becoming a grand narrative is you don't appear like a narrative anymore. You appear transcendental. You appear sublime, right? And the same works within their capital. Now, I'm going to use Apple as an example a couple of times. And I'm sure many of us use iPhones and different Apple products. You know that it is that kind of a capital, it is that kind of an infrastructure, it is that kind of an invisible, endless privilege infrastructure, which actually tells you it is not very practical. It doesn't need to sell practicality. In fact, one of the currencies of Apple is it will tell you shamelessly and spectacularly it is a very impractical product. It will not work if you can't walk into any store and get your iPhone fixed. You have to go to a particular store. In other words, it is very non-commonsensical, non-pragmatic, non-effective. And ironically, that is its currency. People are paying to be unique. People are paying for that particular product because it is not mainstream. Now, Apple is a wonderful example. I realize this is not an advertising class, so I'm going to go not too deep into it. It's actually a very old company, as you know. It's almost as old as Microsoft. But you realize it is that kind of a capital narrative which has somehow managed to preserve its newness and edginess and its kinetic quality. Apple is always edgy. Apple is black coffee. Apple is this slightly hippie capital thing which will always operate as a radical capital territory, while at the same time making an enormous amount of money. Because it's managed to do this golden mean of the capital industry. It has managed to appear hippie and edgy and cutting edge. At the same time, it has managed to appear effective in quality, to the extent that it can actually push the effective bit away. All of us know that Apple products are very impractical. All of us know Apple products don't come with a lot of practical benefits. There are other companies which give you more practical benefits. Ironically, it is this impracticality of Apple which actually sells as a currency. So the point being that when you're talking about infrastructure, the effective can sometimes push away the effective in ways which will actually be more towards capital procurement. So the effective from the Egyptian pyramids to Steve Jobs' Apple are a very profoundly political construct. In fact, one may go as far as saying that the effective is something which manages to become post-construct, which manages to become the sublime ontology of being, to quote Zizek, and I will quote Zizek in the end. Now, what this means is this triangulation of memory, affect, and infrastructure may be described, among other things, with what the media theorist Ernest Hall, H-O-R-L. So most of the references I'm using in this particular talk are from two essays which I've already forwarded to Dr. Anjita, and I'm happy to email both of you. So the full PDFs are available. So Ernest Hall appears something he published recently. Now Hall defines as techno-ecology this particular infrastructural framework, techno-ecology, where technology becomes ecology in a way which is asymmetrical, which is almost organic. You don't realize it's technology anymore because it's so normalized in quality. And this is, again, the very interesting interplay of normalization and sublimation. It is so normalized as a techno-ontology that is part of what we are, who we breathe, how we operate. It almost becomes an organic system of who we are. So we can see how the materiality of technology and the organicity of the human begin to mix in very asymmetric ways. That's what Hall defines as techno-ecology. Now, within this techno-ecology framework, invisible structures of production, dissemination, and this is a key word, control. Production, dissemination, and control are diffused into the sentiment. Notice the word diffused over here. They're not done in a very hardcore kind of way, because then you'll realize this is hardcore. Then you realize this is like something of a coercive thing. In fact, as you know, and this is the old Gramsci understanding of coercion, if you really want to operationalize coercion in its most effective way, we have to turn that into consent. So coercion operates best as consent. When you become the willful subject of coercion, don't even question it, and you buy into it, sometimes willfully, sometimes you think of it as a reward, and I will mention a story in the end with which this can be corroborated. So we can see how this affective infrastructure can sometimes become a function of sublime coercion, whereby the techno-ecology is diffused into the room around us, the space around us, etc. The same sentiment of this techno-ecology diffusing into the environment, the same sentiment is articulated by the social theorist Ben Agger, A-G-G-E-R. Again, these are references which will be available in the two essays I shared. Now, Ben Agger describes how the ubiquitous network of smartphones, they generate a spatio-temporality of I time, not me time, by the way, I time, iPhone time, I time. Now, this I time reconfigures the pre-internet boundaries between public and private, day and night, work and leisure, space and time. Now, this is where I think the work of Dr. Gopi and Dr. Verghese is really important and interesting, because if you look at reels, if you look at the whole idea of how domesticity transforms into a digital space through reels, and how food operates as a vector, through which identity is iterated, through which different forms of stylization is achieved, you realize that in a post-I-time era, where the moment of experiencing, the moment of witnessing, and a moment of commemorating can be one moment. You produce that food, the moment of making that food, baking that cake, the moment of witnessing that happen, and a moment of commemorating it can all condense together in one spatio-temporal framework. And the post-digital infrastructure allows the triangulation to happen. When you experience, you witness, and you remember together. So commemoration, experiencing, and production can come together, crystallize together in very interesting spatio-temporal ways. So it's like a neo-Bakhtinian understanding of chronotop, right? Where the space-time capsule changes in a post-digital age, where you experience and you commemorate at the same time, right? You are experiencing something happening in front of you, you're witnessing that, and you're also commemorating that, all in one particular spatio-temporal frame, thanks to the kinetic infrastructure available to us. Now, this particular triangulation appeared in an article we published in Memory Studies Review a year ago. It was on entangled environments, multimateriality, and sustainable memory ecology. Now, I'll talk about multimateriality in a minute. So what is multimateriality in a post-digital age? So multimateriality may be defined as that structure of knowledge production and consumption which operates through interfaces between a laptop and the human face, between the microphone and a zoom camera, where various interfaces come together to produce the entangled environment where the organic, the digital, the biological, the algorithmic, they all mix together. And when knowledge spreads across interfaces in a very interstitial kind of way, you know what interstaces is, the gap between interfaces, where knowledge leaks in and leaks out of different interfaces. And I use the word leak quite deliberately because I'm going to talk about Andy Clark in a minute. Now, in that particular article, which was published in Memory Studies Review, we wanted to highlight the affective and connective aspects of sentient systems of transfer and reconstruction. Now, what is sentient systems? Feeling systems, where feeling is not just located in a human body. Feeling becomes more and more pushed outside of the body, where you have the idea of the ambient space, the feeling space, or the feeling time, where obviously feeling becomes a purchasable commodity, right? Where when you're buying a product, you're not just buying a product because of what it can serve you functionally, but also what it can make you feel. So feeling becomes less and less organic in quality in an age of post-digital infrastructure, where infrastructure can become feeling, where the relationship between infrastructure and feeling begin to blend in very interesting ways. And therein lies the whole idea of invisibility and the production of presence. Now, I hope most of you will agree with me at this point that when you're looking at infrastructure in this particular way, where it is beginning to move away from being just effective and becoming more and more effective, presence requires invisibility. Presence and invisibility do not operate as ontological categories anymore. In fact, if you want to be present in a most effective way, the infrastructure which makes you present must be invisibilized. Because if you are aware, if you can see the cameras behind, if you can see the wires behind, if you can see the materials behind, your effective, sublime presence will be compromised. Your sublimity as a presence, and you can see how even politics works in very interesting ways. If you look at how political leaders across the world, they produce presence, in terms of how they appear in interviews, how they appear coming in, walking out, etc. The cameras must become more and more invisible. It should become less material in quality. And it's not an accident that technology too has begun to acquire the vocabulary of invisibility. Wireless, for example, contactless, for example, right? So you can look how even the vocabulary of techno-ecology today it is heavily plugged into the vocabulary of invisibility. So the more invisible the technology is, the more effective it will become, the more sublime it will become, the more effective apparatus it will be able to produce. Now, allow me now to come to sort of draw on a little bit in cognitive theory, on cognitive theory. And one cognitive theorist that I'm particularly fond of drawing on is Andy Clark. Now, Andy Clark, of course, is famous for many things, but what I'm going to talk about here is this very famous 4E model of cognition. What are the 4E models, the 4E dimensions of Clark? The first E is embedded. The second E is embodied. The third B is inactive. And the fourth B is extended. Right? Now let's look at it from a human perspective. Now all of us, as you know, we are a bunch of neurons and fibers and muscles and whatever, synapses, you can go even further. That is embedded in us. Now all these things together become one body, which then becomes the embodied avatar. We operate as an organism holistically, hopefully. We make sense, etc. Now, of course, it doesn't stop there. Now, it becomes inactive in quality. I mean, how we talk, how we speak, how we carry ourselves. Again, notice the vocabulary, how we carry ourselves, right? So that becomes the inactive bit. How do we enact our cognition? So do we speak sophisticatedly? Do we use the right kind of vocabulary? Are we equipped linguistically to make sense, to gain cultural currency, etc.? The last bit is extended. So what are the prosthetic devices through which we extend our cognition? This microphone is a good example of that, right? Now, of course, the reason why this particular 4E model becomes interesting in a post-digital age is that when we talk about, let's say, the techno-ecological platforms through which knowledge production happens. So this particular conference, or any conference as a case in point, when you use the word hybrid, which is a very, very acceptable vocabulary in knowledge production and consumption, we talk about hybrid. Of this particular knowledge system and knowledge production actually is a very interesting dialing back of the 4E model, where the borderlines between the embedded, embodied, Transcorporeality and this idea of technology as an interlocutor, we offer a new theory which is likely to be published sometime soon, and again, I'll be happy to send the PDF when it appears, the theory of digicorporeality. Now, what does digicorporeality mean? The corporeal as always already digital. So the difference between the biological and the digital is gone. Where you are already a digital avatar, where you're already operating, always already operating as a post-digital presence. So the corporeal operates as an always already digital avatar through complex modes of information and infrastructure. Now this connects squarely and philosophically, I hope, with the title of my talk, which is Memory, Affect, and Invisible Infrastructure. Now, let me now move to the concluding part of my talk. So when you talk about digicorporeality, now there are lots of very interesting machines you can think of, let's say bio watches that you can wear, different forms of devices which can tell you your heartbeat, which can tell you your cardio movements, which can count the number of steps you walk. So there's a different medical industry which has emerged out of giving a metrics of your body in terms of you can see, you can quantify your body in a way where the biological and digital begin to blur away. We're not talking about that directly. We're talking about how this medical memory devices can connect to transactional memory. Let's say, and this is a truism again, you go to Amazon, you buy a couple of things, you go to Amazon again next day, the same couple of things are dangled in front of you, right? Because that's how the algorithms remember. And the algorithms remember not because algorithms are nostalgic and sentimental. Algorithms remember because they want to anticipate. And I'll come back to the anticipation bit later. Again, it's a very ancient thing. I will end with that. So algorithmic memory, as you can see, whether it is transactional in quality, kinetic in quality, they manage to connect retrospection and anticipation. The reason why big companies spend so much time stealing our data is not because they are very keen to know what we eat, not very keen to know our nutritional habits, but because that data can help them algorithmize future in a way that they are more likely to profile people based on data and create preemptive categories, prophetic categories. Well, this person is more likely to purchase this. So data operates as a futuristic quality over here. Now, the other article which I shared with Dr. Anjita talks about the post-digital, post-colonial, which again talks about how in a post-colonial condition, the invisible infrastructures begin to operate in very interesting ways. I'll not go too deep into it, but just to highlight the basic philosophical premise. So the complexly kinetic, intercorporeal, and inter-affective economy. So again, notice how kinetic, corporeal, and affective come together. That particularly governs, that particular economy governs the way we inhabit and internalize our experiences today in terms of how there's no subject today who is not already inside the post-digital intersubjective framework, right? So you cannot say that I am outside of the post-digital subject economy because you're already inside it in terms of very invisible ways. Now let me conclude with two fundamental tenets in memory studies. Now we talked about infrastructure, we talked about kinesis, we talked about algorithms, we talked about how the politics of presence sometimes ironically requires invisibility. In fact, the most sublime the presence, that will rely on many invisible structures beneath it, etc. Now let me conclude with two fundamental tenets in memory studies. And then I will end with a story. Lest we forget that we are also storytellers. At the end of the day, we are students of literature and cultural studies, and as seductive as digitality appears and as seductive this research is, it's important to ground us back to the literary function, to the cultural function. And it is not some kind of a compromise. I will end with a note of optimism, if I may, in terms of how we should actually read more literature in a world we live in today. How actually literature helps us understand invisible architecture and infrastructure better. But that's something I will end with. Now, the two fundamental tenets in memory studies both sound like ironical paradoxes, but actually they are connected theorems, if you may. The first one is that when we remember something, we are also forgetting something, and that's a truism. So every brain, for example, is hardwired to forget. Every brain is hardwired to forget, even and especially when it is remembering. Now, I'll just give you one banal example, very banal example, if you forgive me. If I were to ask you, what did you do on 14 November 2025? You probably tell me, well, I got up at 7, had my coffee, had my breakfast, took a car or taxi or a bus, came to VIT Amravati, where someone from IIT Madras came and gave a very weird talk on memory studies. Now, if I were to ask you a week later, what did you do on 14 November 2025? You probably just remember coming to VIT Amravati and listen to a weird talk. If I were to ask you 1 year later, you will have forgotten the weird talk and just say, well, I came to VIT Amravati. Now, what is happening with each representation is that you are chunking out information. Now, that's easy. We know that. Now, here's a funny thing. Even the version you're telling me today, when I'm asking you, what did you do on 14 November 2025, I can guarantee you, you have forgotten 70% of whatever you've done already. So I hope none of you remember which hand you used when you went for the coffee mug in the morning. I hope none of you remember how many times you moved your hand when you brushed your teeth. I hope none of you remember that, because that's the problem, right? If you remember it, that is a big problem. Because the brain is hardwired to offload information. The brain is hardwired to forget. It must forget. That's how we are hardwired. As the mammalian brain is very sophisticated, it must forget. Because if it doesn't forget, there are many other cognitive abilities which will become compromised. Imagination will become compromised, empathy will become compromised. Most importantly, the ability to anticipate will become compromised. Very big ability. Okay. Which brings me to anticipation. The second paradox in memory studies. The first one is remembering and forgetting must operate together if you want to make sense. The second paradox is every act of retrospection, when you retrospect, reconstruct, likewise, depending on what our country remembers, what a nation remembers, what a particular historical body remembers, it will have a certain kind of a toolkit to move forward in future. So you know the reasons why politicians across the world sometimes use nostalgia is not because they are sentimental people, that's primarily because they need a certain kind of toolkit from the past to forge forward a certain kind of policy for the future. Right, and that's a very ancient thing. There's nothing new about it. Every emperor, every politician, every prime minister across the world, they have found ways to weaponize nostalgia, just so they can forge forward a certain kind of future. And that is exactly how collective memory also works. So every act of retrospection, whether it's collective or molecular, is also simultaneously an act of anticipation. Now, what this means is, why did I mention these two theorems in memory studies? You'll notice that infrastructure also works in very interesting, similar ways. Infrastructures of memory also produce forgetting. Infrastructures of memory also must construct amnesia in interesting ways. For example, the whole idea of episodic memory, the whole idea of how we consume knowledge today, it also forces us to forget many things, right? So I belong to that generation, for example, at least in Kolkata. I think this part of India was technologically more advanced. So I'm talking about late 90s, early 2000, when the internet was coming, and we sort of saw the internet come. I was that generation which saw the internet come in a certain sense when we were finishing school, moving to college, etc. Prior to the internet, I can tell you from my example, I could remember at least 10 to 15 phone numbers, like landline numbers, because there was something called STD boot. None of you may have seen it. You go to a place, take an auto, pay up money, pick up a phone and call. Now, if you got lost as a kid or as someone walking around, you have to call a particular number by paying a certain person, so you have to remember phone numbers. So at least 10 to 15 phone numbers I had to remember. The only phone number I remember today is my wife's, because I don't have to, right? Because technology hasn't just produced a memory ecology. The infrastructure has also produced oblivion. It has required oblivion. It has managed to unremember many things. So you can see how infrastructure also operates with this very interesting entanglement of memory, commemoration, and amnesia. And they are not always oppositional categories. The second thing I mentioned, how every act of retrospection also produces anticipation. This is easier to understand. I just gave you an example already. All the big data mining that companies do when they store information about your purchase, whether it's a Zomato order or an Amazon order, etc., the same data pool will be used to anticipate your future purchases, right? So again, there's some kind of profiling happening over here, and that is why companies pay so much money to collect data, because that would help us, in a certain sense, anticipate what the particular subject is likely to purchase in the times to come. So again, we can see how infrastructure operates in this very interesting entanglement. Let me end with a story. This is a pre-digital story, maybe familiar to the cultural studies people over here. A story recounted several times by Slavoj Žižek, who I mentioned once already. So this is a story about East Germany. This is a story where there was still East Germany. This is before the Berlin Wall fell. So where if someone was suspected of something, of a treason-like activity, would be sent to a hard labor camp. And of course, the person's movements, writings, everything would be heavily censored. So in this particular climate, one particular everyman, East German man, is about to get sent to a hard labor camp. Before he's sent to the labor camp, he sits down to have one last meal with his friends. And he comes up with this deal. He says, well, I'm going to write letters to you from the labor camp, but because this is a labor camp, they will read my letters. Of course, that's the whole point of being in a labor camp. It's not a vacation. And because they read my letters, I can't tell you many things. So we have to come up with a code. So what is a code? If I'm writing a letter to you in blue ink, assume everything I'm writing is true, correct. However, if I'm writing to you in red ink, just invert the logic. In other words, if I'm saying I am okay, I'm fine, I'm happy in blue ink, it actually means I'm okay and fine, I'm happy. If I'm writing the same thing in red ink, it probably means I'm dying. That's a code that is established, and then he's sent off to the hard labor camp. A month later, his friends receive a letter from him, written in blue ink, where he's saying, well, you know, the hard labor camp is not that hard. We play football in the weekends, there's butter, honey, bread every day. We sometimes watch movies as well. In fact, I would go as far as saying we have pretty much everything we need to be happy, except one thing, we don't have red ink. Now, what does this mean? This is invisible infrastructure, right? This is the power of invisibilization. And the reason why I deliberately and stubbornly chose a pre-digital story is because it's easy to be seduced by digitality today and think we are uniquely doomed. We are not. Now, this is a very narcissistic thing, and I will say this very unpopular thing as a student of cultural studies. Every age thinks it is uniquely doomed. Every age thinks this is the worst. This is nothing like this has ever happened before, right? Cognition has come to an end. Knowledge has come to an end. People don't trust each other. Read Tennyson's In Memoriam. Read any literature after the Darwinian movement, right? They'd all say, well, this is the end. There's no faith anymore. There's no church anymore. There's no religion anymore. We all came from monkeys, right? I mean, there's nothing called belief anymore. Go back to the Greeks, who would tell you we are doomed from the moment you are born. Nothing works. It's a non-causal universe. There's no logic, there's no rationality, nothing. So it's important for us to rescue ourselves from the narcissism of being uniquely doomed because we are post-digital infrastructures. I will end by saying we must, and I'm pretty sure Dr. Gopi and Dr. Verghese had this philosophy in mind when they conceptualized this conference. I mean, yes, we're looking at infrastructure in a post-digital way. Yes, we have to talk about cloud computing and algorithms, absolutely. But we also have to historicize the ontology of infrastructure. So infrastructure is a very ancient thing. Infrastructure started with the cave drawings. Infrastructure started pretty much when we invented the wheel, when we started building machines, when Homo sapiens became Homo faber, man the tool-making animal. More importantly, when Homo sapiens became Homo narrativus, man the storytelling animal. I mentioned that I will end with literature, that I will talk about the unique relevance of literature in a world we live in today. Now you'll notice that when I said that every culture will have its unique screams of panic, you would find that, let's say when the e-book came into being, when the Kindle came into being, there's this big panic, well, no one's going to read books anymore. But we have data to prove exactly the opposite. Book sales have actually gone up after, post-digital infrastructure. And before we start romanticizing the book, we must also remind ourselves that a book achieves sacrality because it had more time in the playfield. When a book first appeared from the printing press, it was a vulgar material. It was bad AI back in the day, right? Less sophisticated people read novels in vernacular languages, right? Printing press was a dirty thing back in the day. The reason why it became sacred is because it had more time to play in the level field. It achieved sacrality through a historical process. I will invite you, this audience, to end with this concluding thought. When we talk about AR, VR, augmented reality, virtual reality, the way we can, let's say, construct infrastructure through Oculus, and we can give you a sense of future cities, we can give you a sense of retro cities, etc. We had a device way before these things happened. That device was called a novel. That device was a book through which you could immerse yourself in a world you didn't know and co-create the infrastructure with a sinking boat, a shipwrecked sailor who gets into an island and creates a plantation, takes over, territorializes, and becomes the emperor of that island. And you go along with that person, you keep building the infrastructure, and you become aware of the politics of presence, power, visibility, invisibility, which is embedded in an infrastructure narrative. And I'm talking about Robinson Crusoe, one of the earliest novels ever written. So I will end with this image of infrastructure. Infrastructure is not just digitality, algorithms, what we can see, what we can conceive, what we can theorize. It is not the evil capital out there. That's a very blunt binary. Infrastructure is in our head. Infrastructure is how we conceive and project power. And I think this idea of infrastructure will receive perhaps the best critical academic attention if we reconnect, and we keep connecting. I refuse to believe that a generation today reads less than our generation. I think the generation today is smarter and wiser than we are. Every generation is smarter than the earlier generation. And anyone who's saying the opposite is probably living in denial. I think storytelling, story reading, fiction, literature, that is still probably our best bet in terms of understanding how infrastructures work, operate, visibilize, and invisibilize in a world we inhabit today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, sir. That was a very thought-provoking and very insightful talk. I was going to summarize it, but then you already did a great job at that. So we'll quickly use this time for a quick question and answer sessions. It was so interesting. I am very much compelled to believe that there must be some questions. We have our students here also. So I'm opening the floor for any kind of questions that you might have for the speaker. He spoke on, the title of his talk was Memory, Affect and Invisible Infrastructures, and we do look forward for a hopeful future, hopeful digital world. And infrastructures, he emphasized that infrastructures must be invisibilized as presence requires invisibility. So that is one key thing that I will be using for my own presentation today as well. So any questions? Do we have any questions? Any questions from the audience? Yes, we have one question over there. Can I request the student volunteers to give a mic over there? Could you please raise your hand? Yeah. Excuse me.
Yes, my question is about as invisible infrastructure is also in the digital sector, for example, the algorithm of the social media, how it is actually impacting the user's behavior in case of reinforcing memory, and also how it is actually impacting the emotional intelligence of a user. Is it actually impacting positively in case of students and also the teenagers who are using it, or is it being a negative impact of that invisible infrastructure in social media?
Shall we take questions together? Can I answer it?
Yes,
now?
we can take it one by one.
Thank you. It's a great question. The easy and sometimes lazy response to this really excellent question would be, oh no, this is terrible. And because students are consuming knowledge through tablets and different forms of episodic narratives of digitality, they must have less attention span, they must have less memory, they must have less cognitive abilities. We don't really have any scientific data to corroborate that. That is the panic narrative which can be peddled through different forms of amateurish pseudoscientific belief systems. Now, when I said, if you remember that nostalgic thing that I said, that I used to remember 15 phone numbers back in the day, I just remember my wife's phone number, and the story, what that story sells is, it's a very manipulative story. I realized I was being very manipulative, that, oh no, this must mean that we remember less today compared to what we remember earlier. But I should also tell you, the second part of the story which I invisibilized, is that I remember many passwords which I never had back in the day. I remember 10, 15 different passwords, my bank passwords, my Paytm passwords, the different kinds of passwords which didn't exist back in the time, right? So the memory ecology will shift. Now, depending on the memory ecology, the ontology of memory will also shift. Right, so for example, and this is what Andrew Hoskins also says, that we mustn't look at apparatus as a passive presence. Apparatus is an interlocutor of memory. So when an apparatus changes, your interlocution will change, and when the interlocution changes, then your nature of memory will also change. Right? So what is the interaction you're doing, in terms of what are you interacting with? Because memory, if you remember, that's the first premise I started with. Memory is an interactive activity. Memory is not a static activity. You're interacting with the environment. So the environment is changing. Your ontology of memory will also change. Now, whether the change will be better or worse, I don't really buy, maybe I don't know enough, I don't really buy an easy narrative in this. It must become worse because it is digital. I don't think that is the case at all. Rather, there are many studies to show that our cognitive ability is actually going up because of the kind of apparatus we are consuming. There is one scientific experiment that I can give you from my understanding of this. Of course, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I do hang out with some people who are neuroscientists, so I pick up some stories. So there was a really interesting research by someone called Eleanor Maguire, who very tragically passed away earlier this year. Now, Eleanor Maguire was a neuroscientist who did a study of what is called the London black taxi drivers. Now, if you remember, if anyone has seen any James Bond film, there's always, if it is shot in London, there's an evil Russian guy who comes in a black taxi. Now, the black taxi in London is very difficult to get a license of a black taxi because in order to get the license of a black taxi, you must be able to navigate every part of the city without GPS. That is a license test. Okay, so you need to know every corner of the city without using technology. Only then you're able to get a license of the black taxi. So which obviously means it requires a huge amount of memory. Now, Eleanor Maguire did a study of London taxi drivers, and the study revealed at the end that there are actual anatomical changes in the hippocampus, which is the memory center, of London taxi drivers. Now, what this means is, depending on your interaction and activity, actual anatomical changes take place in a memory system of the brain. So ecology is not just some beautiful aesthetic thing. interaction is not just some passive, lovely architecture out there. Interaction actually informs you in a cellular, molecular way. So depending on whether you're consuming knowledge through a blackboard or a smartboard, that will determine what kind of cognitive apparatus you have, right? Now, I think it's a little bit risky to have a neat narrative or good or bad about this. I think it's a little bit dangerous to peddle that narrative by saying, well, just because this particular generation is consuming knowledge through an already digital process, they must be less wise than a previous generation. I'm not entirely sure, and I don't think, as far as I know, there's no study which corroborates that. But we do have study which tells us that your ability to remember, your mammalian material memory system in your head, anatomical system in your head, will change depending on what you're consuming, depending on what you're interacting with. So that's an absolute given.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I think. Yeah. I can hear you, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, for the audience. Yeah, can we have the mic, please, real quick?
Hi, Dr. Parui. My question is regarding the aspect of attention, which is very closely linked with our cognitive aspect of memory, language, etc. We hear these narratives of our attention span being brought down with the digital spaces, right? So how much, what is your take on it, and how do you believe that this has an effect on our, how does that affect our invisible infrastructures? And there, when algorithms are competing to get our attention, and there are these various stimuli, and that dictates what we watch. And how does it? What is your take on it?
Yeah, again, great question. So you're quite right. This is a very, very heavily circulating narrative in terms of how attention span must necessarily decrease because you're consuming knowledge networks which are episodic in quality. What we're seeing are reels, what we're seeing are like shorts in terms of news items. You don't have the patience, apparently, to go through a 45-minute news discussion, etc. Now, the counter to that argument is we also end up consuming more in terms of our attention is more distributive in quality. Now, depending on how you define attention, now if you define attention in terms of immersivity, then yes, we are ready to buy that argument, but attention is also distributive in quality in terms of how much you're able to do in the course of 24 hours. So if you compare, let's say, a generation, some of our young colleagues over here, who are, let's say, in the early 20s and mid-20s, the amount of work they cover in the duration of one 24-hour clock would be unimaginable, let's say, to someone like me in our early 40s, way back in the 90s. Now, we may counter that in a manipulative way by saying, oh, I read Dostoevsky. Do you read Dostoevsky? You read shorts. But that doesn't prove anything. I think that's a very elitist argument, that you're saying just because you read fat novels by dead white men makes you a wiser person compared to a generation which is consuming knowledge through digitality. There's absolutely no scientific evidence which says that the attention span defined, because see, depending on what benchmark are we using? We're using the word attention. We're defining attention by using the yardsticks of reading Dostoevsky. That's not going to work in a generation which is consuming knowledge in a very different way. So we need to change your definition of attention. If you change it, if you make it more aligned to digitality, I, for one, is optimistic in saying that we probably have a generation which has more attention compared to what we did in the earlier time, because it is more distributed, it's more spread across, it's more interfacial in quality. It does more. At the end of 24 hours, it covers more. It aligns more, it connects more, it is more cognitively active compared to a pre-digital mind, because it is so kinetic in quality, right? So the kinesis of the digital ecology today, in my mind, maybe it's just me being optimistic in a naive way, that kinesis, in my mind, actually makes the mind more kinetic in quality. So we probably have a smarter, wiser, more brilliant generation compared to us who just boasted about reading novels. So, yeah.
Thank you, sir. I'm so sorry we have to just conclude the Q&A session also because we are getting late for lunch. Post-lunch at 2, we have our offline sessions. So I request everyone to be there. And we now break for lunch. And if you have any, I'm pretty sure that our students, they are very curious students. And it was a very interesting talk and they must have questions. If you would really like to connect with sir, we would be more than happy to share his contact details with you. So let's keep the question and answers and the conversations going through emails or calls or however sir would choose. So sir, it has been an absolute delight to have you with us. Thank you so much for taking our time from what I have seen a very pretty busy schedule. So thank you so much, sir, and a huge round of applause for sir for his very insightful talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much, sir. So we now break for lunch, and please be there, please be here for the offline sessions. We start sharply at 2. So from 2 we have our offline sessions, and then we'll be concluding the day with a cultural performance at 5:30. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day. Thank you.